Rep Anderson, would you mind doing a sound check with me?
I hear you loud and clear.
You hear me and I hear you. That's perfect. If anything happens from now to whenever, just give me a quick shout out in the chat and enjoy the meeting.
Thank you.
Well, not yet,
Oh, not yet.
but see how this is read? Live.
Just as an informational point, we'll be starting in about 5 minutes. I'm just zooming up. And Senator Hartley, the co-chair, is stuck in the ubiquitous traffic that we seem to find around the Capitol. I expect to hear in 15 or 20 minutes, but that will not slow the startup. So just bear with me for a couple of minutes.
Finance
Mhm.
meeting. Please.
Yeah, I don't know that. I was in the meeting or remote on that, but it was cold. It is again today. So now when you get it, we can use this at that point when you find it. So I want to welcome everyone to the meeting today. This CONNSTEP Informational Forum. Particularly want to welcome Beatriz Gutierrez, the CEO. I understand that Tom Williams couldn't make it today, and we will have a presentation analysis by Andrew Phillips, who's global government infrastructure, economic finance, and tax leader, and Ernst. I want to welcome you. I look forward to the presentation. There cannot escape anyone that we have a very strong bipartisan group in commerce. Our focus is, in all cases, business development and growth of the state. Everything that moves us forward raises all boats within the economy of the state, raises the revenue, provides us with the resources to grow, provide employment. So I'm looking forward to hearing the report. I will open it up with comments from our ranking. We'll start with, because he's right to my left, we will go to Representative Harris, but we'll start with the Senator, Senator Martin.
He is so eloquent, isn't he? So let's just start the presentation with me. So thank you all.
And Representative Harrison.
Thank you. Looking forward to the presentation. I know you have had many meetings and I think everyone's anxious to hear. Thank you.
So if you'd want to begin.
Sure. Mr. Chairman, Senator Martin, Representative Harrison, committee members, good morning. I'm Beatriz Gutierrez, President and CEO of CONNSTEP, Connecticut's MEP. The Hollins Manufacturing Extension Partnership, MEP, is based at the National Institute for Standards and Technology, NIST, under the U.S. Department of Commerce. The national network is made up of 51 MEP centers, one in each state plus Puerto Rico, with over 1,400 trusted advisors that work every day helping American companies implement technology, create productivity, grow in new markets, grow their domestic markets, and most importantly, work and develop the next generation of American workers. Together, these centers strengthen communities and help build U.S. manufacturing. CONNSTEP was created in 1994 by a partnership of NIST and the Department of Commerce, the Department of Economic Development, DECD. This center started with their funding and continues to be supported by both institutions to this day. We are a private 501c3 nonprofit organization governed by a manufacturing industry-driven board of directors with the mission to help Connecticut small and medium manufacturers reach their goals by improving their strategic, technical, and operational expertise, thus supporting the growth of the Connecticut economy. We pride ourselves in our measurable impacts, and in fiscal 2023, our work contribute to creating 978 jobs at our clients, 30.2 millions of cost savings, 39 millions of new client investments, and 226.1 millions of total increase in retained sales. We are very proud to be an active contributor to the growth of the manufacturing ecosystem in the state. In January 25, 2021, President Biden issued Executive Order 14005, titled Ensuring the Future is Made in All of America by All American Workers, and established a substantial role for the MEP National Network in the strengthening of American manufacturing. Under that guidance, MEP National Network offers several services, including supplier scouting and supply chain optimization and intelligence network, SCOIN. This initiative is focused on assessing and analyzing domestic manufacturing capabilities, expanding knowledge of state and local manufacturing ecosystems, and building an integrated U.S. Manufacturing supplier network to address the supply challenges that we all saw very vividly during our COVID pandemic. CONNSTEP received a grant in 2023 to execute this directive over 2 years. Additionally, the Connecticut General Assembly, through Special Act 2124, an act establishing a manufacturing technology working group, appointed CONNSTEP and CCAT, Connecticut Center for Advanced Technology, to chair the I-4.0 working group that operated from August of 2021 to October of 2022. The group recommended continuing to deploy process innovation and technology solutions to support the manufacturing workforce, develop a resilient supply chain, and promote and assist small and medium manufacturers in technology adoption to strengthen our state's manufacturing sector competitive position. The report we're presenting today goes, in partnership with Ernst & Young, goes a step further. Innovate to compete. An assessment of Connecticut supply chains in aerospace, shipbuilding, and medical devices provides a comprehensive analysis of Connecticut's critical supply chains and recognizes that to remain competitive, our state needs to continue embracing product and process innovation at all levels of the supply chain. This report identifies relevant benchmarks for Connecticut to measure its progress as we continue investing in our manufacturing industry. Andrew Phillips from Ernst & Young will present the study's findings. Andrew.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Vice Chair, for convening us, and to Senator Hartley, members of the Commerce Committee and the Manufacturing Caucus for allowing me to present today. And thank you to CONNSTEP for asking us to do this work. So what I'm going to share today is sort of a summarized version of the information contained in the report that Beatrice just mentioned. Senator Hartley has a copy of this report, and it will be available to everyone after today's presentation. All right. So to summarize, EY was asked to, by CONNSTEP, to look at potential economic gaps related to Connecticut's supply chain for 3 critical manufacturing industries, aerospace, shipbuilding, and medical devices. And these industries were chosen by CONNSTEP because they're both, really significant to the manufacturing sector in Connecticut, but also really to the overall economy of the state. And so to do this analysis, we looked at kind of 4 dimensions of supply chain strength and industry strength in a few different ways. So the first dimension is the growth and concentration of employment in the industry, so in each of these 3 sectors relative to other states and over time. The second is sort of the trends related to in-state sourcing of inputs. So what are Connecticut OEMs purchasing from the supply chains that support these 3 sectors? The third dimension is innovation, and then the fourth dimension is cost. And so to do this work, to analyze the industries in these 3 dimensions, we did a few different things. So the first was a relatively extensive quantitative analysis using publicly available data sources and a few proprietary data sources, some of which are from federal sources like the U.S. Census Bureau, Bureau of Labor Statistics, Bureau of Economic Analysis, National Science Foundation related to patent activity. And then we also looked at 2 other types of information. One is qualitative information that we collected in structured interviews with about 10 companies in Connecticut operating as suppliers or OEMs in these 3 sectors. And then the final source of information for the study was an online survey that we conducted with the same types of businesses where we had responses back from about 50, mostly small and medium-sized businesses in Connecticut serving these 3 sectors, plus a handful of OEMs. So I'll spend the balance of our time going through some relatively detailed results, but I would just maybe call out a couple trends that you might look for as I go through the rest of the information. So first, I would say, as we think about these 3 sectors in Connecticut, aerospace and shipbuilding tend to perform a bit stronger than medical devices. We've seen, particular employment growth in the shipbuilding sector, relatively strong in-state sourcing of inputs in aerospace, and medical devices, we've seen a bit of a decline, and the concentration of medical devices in Connecticut has never been quite as strong as the other 2 sectors. Other sort of general trends that will come out are cost of living and to some degree business costs tend to be a less competitive area for Connecticut. Innovation is sort of a mixed bag depending on which industry you're looking at. And then, concentration, as I mentioned, kind of varies by sector. So a lot of the conclusions that we'll draw and the sort of the points that I'll make are based on putting Connecticut in a relative comparison to other states. And so the general format for those comparisons is that we have 15 states that we've chosen for each industry, and those states are generally based on the concentration of the industries in each place. And so as you would guess, the geographic footprint of the US aerospace industry differs somewhat from what we would see in shipbuilding or medical devices. And I won't go through all the states on the slide, but these are the peer states that are included for each of our 3 sectors. And you'll notice, some expected states for aerospace, for instance, of course, Washington State, Kansas is in that list. For shipbuilding, Maine, Virginia, as examples of states with very active shipbuilding industries. And then medical devices, Massachusetts, Minnesota, California are states that everyone would recognize. And the rest of the states in that list also have relatively high concentration of employment relative to the overall economy, which is why they were selected. All right, so then starting to get into the data. So these 3 sectors in Connecticut, as of 2022, employed nearly 55,000 workers. The aerospace industry employed nearly 29,000, or was actually slightly more than 29,000 workers. Shipbuilding was around 13,000, and medical devices was around 12,000. So when you add that up, that 55,000 approximate worker count is about 35% of overall manufacturing employment in the state and about 3.1% of the state's overall workforce. So, when you can isolate 1/3 of the entire manufacturing industry to just these 3 sectors, it suggests, we should have a focus on these 3 sectors, which is why CONNSTEP asked us to do this work. And you might also look at that 3.1% of overall workforce and conclude that it's not that big of a number. But, in thinking about economic development in any state, you have a lot of workers in any state that are focused on serving the local population. And so really economic growth has to come from export serving industries, right? And those are manufacturers, those can be financial services, technology, things that can be sold to customers outside the state. And these three industries that we're talking about today are great examples of that and have the potential for growth in Connecticut. So when we look, though, at the trends, as you can see in the chart, the trends vary somewhat from industry to industry. So aerospace, which is the line at the top, you can see is very cyclical, rises and falls with the broader economy. And the bars, the sort of horizontal, vertical bars in gray are the recessions, and we have three that have happened during this time period. And you can see after each recession, aerospace industry employment, both in Connecticut and also nationwide, tends to fall as orders fall off. Medical devices, which is shown in the red, has had a somewhat slow and steady decline over the past 20 years, and over the past 10 years has contracted at 1.6% a year on average. And then shipbuilding is perhaps the brightest spot here, with an annual growth rate of 4% over the past decade, and a size that now actually surpasses medical devices. All right, so that's the growth and the scale of the industries, but what about the concentration of these industries, and why do we even talk about concentration? The simple answer for why we look at concentration as a measure of kind of the health and significance of the industry in a state is that the simple logic is basically any very large state is going to have a relatively large number of employees in every industry. And so looking at the sheer number of employees isn't necessarily a good measure of the business climate or the significance of that industry in the state. So what we look at on this slide is the share of total employment in each of these states that is contributed by our three sectors, with aerospace on the left, shipbuilding in the center, and medical devices on the right. And so you can see Connecticut is the third most concentrated state in terms of aerospace, with only Washington State and Kansas surpassing the level of employment concentration in aerospace in Connecticut. So 1.7% of all Connecticut workers are employed in aerospace, compared to 0.3% in the US and 1.9% in Washington State. For shipbuilding, it's a similar but perhaps less extreme story. 0.1% of all workers in the US are in shipbuilding. In Connecticut, it's 0.7%. And when we go to a state like Maine, it's all the way up at 2.1%. So clearly, in Maine, shipbuilding is a very significant industry, as one would guess. Medical devices is where Connecticut has perhaps the least concentration of our three. 0.5% of US workers are employed in that medical device industry. In Connecticut, it's 0.7. So Connecticut's somewhat surpassing the US average, but it's not by that much. All right, so then when we look at some of the highest level indicators for sort of supply chain and industry trends in Connecticut, here are a few things we see. I mentioned the employment growth rates. One thing I hadn't mentioned so far was the Connecticut overall employment growth rate over the same period, 0.1%, right? So the overall Connecticut economy in terms of workforce is growing, slight positive, but of course, aerospace and medical devices is actually falling behind the rest of the state. When we look at the share of supplier purchases that Connecticut OEMs are purchasing from Connecticut suppliers, aerospace does relatively well. So 20% of the parts and raw materials and services that are purchased by a Connecticut manufacturer are coming from other Connecticut businesses and supporting jobs and other types of economic activity and tax revenue in those businesses. When we look at shipbuilding and medical devices, those percentages are a bit smaller, 9 to 10%. And then another metric, which will seem different than the others, and we're going to drill into it later in the discussion, is the share of employees in these three sectors that are 55 years or older. And the reason we look at this is related to the talent pipeline and understanding, over the next 10 years, as you anticipate retirement of these workers, what would it take to essentially replace them with workers that will have the appropriate skills and training to maintain at least the current size of the industry. And when we look at that, we see, roughly 1/3 of the workers in the aerospace sector are 55 years or older, and one might expect to retire at some point over the next decade. Medical devices, similarly high, 37% of those workers are at that same age level. And shipbuilding tends to skew younger than the overall workforce, mostly because of the rapid growth that has been fulfilled by training typically younger workers. Okay, so on the next 3 slides, we have sort of the same format for each of the 3 industries. So I'll take a moment to explain how this works. So on the table on the right, we have absolute number of employees. We have the share, which I've already gone through, and then we have the growth rates for these industries. And on the left, what you can see sort of going across from left to right is the share of state employment in these sectors, and vertically up and down is the growth rate. So states in the top left are not very concentrated, but are growing quickly. States in the bottom right are very concentrated, but are contracting. And you can see Connecticut is among the sort of most concentrated states, as I've mentioned, in terms of aerospace, but unfortunately, it sits in good company with Kansas and Washington State, all 3 of which are contracting in terms of aerospace employment in each of those states. The states that are growing tend to be the states that do have smaller employment bases and typically lower cost structures. And those are states like Oklahoma and Utah, where you have some smaller manufacturers that have set up shop. The other thing, it's not necessarily a trend to point out, but just kind of as an informational point, overall employment in the US aerospace industry is 500,000. Connecticut's around 30,000. Washington State and California have the largest employment bases at over 70,000 apiece. So just as you think about sort of what's at stake in terms of capturing a bit more of this particular industry, those are the types of scales of employment that are involved. Okay, similar type of chart now for shipbuilding, where we have a few states that are kind of dominant in the shipbuilding space. Virginia is the largest in terms of the number of shipbuilding employees, 40,000 out of the nation's approximately 190 shipbuilding workers. When you look at the states that are most concentrated, I mentioned a few of these, Maine, Rhode Island, Hawaii, and all 3 of those states have growth rates that are above 2%. Rhode Island actually grew at 5.5% during the decade that we look at in this chart. So I would say in terms of shipbuilding, Connecticut's 4% growth rate sits kind of relatively in line with the rest of the country, with the country's top performing shipbuilding states, including your neighbor, Rhode Island. All right, so then the same format for medical devices, where we have some states with very significant medical device employment, and it's actually the largest US industry of the 3 we're talking about. So nationwide, we have 765,000 workers in medical devices. 160,000 of them are in California, with about 40,000 each then in Minnesota and Massachusetts, and Connecticut comes in with 12,000. In terms of the share of workers in the sectors, Connecticut ranks, I think it's around 7th. And then the thing that is perhaps the most interesting on this slide is what we see in terms of growth in the overall industry and in some of these top performing states, where in California, in Massachusetts, Minnesota, Utah, we have growth rates that range from 0.4% in Massachusetts all the way up to 2.8% in Utah. So it's not that the industry overall is declining in the US, it's that the Connecticut industry seems to be in decline, and that activity is migrating to states like Utah and California. Sure.
What's contributing to that?
I would think in the medical device space, I mean, innovation and new product development is going to be key. And Connecticut, you'll see in some of our later slides, Connecticut has a very strong research environment but in terms of new product innovation, tends to rank a bit lower than other states. California, on the other hand, one would argue has a non-competitive cost environment, but a very strong research and innovation environment, and that may be attracting some of those businesses to California.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so actually you took us right to our next slide. Thank you. So two quick points here on innovation, which I think I just made. So the table on the left shows patent activity per 1,000 STEM workers, where STEM is science, technology, engineering, and math workers. So think of these as potentially research-focused or technical employees working in Connecticut and these other states. And this is essentially the level of research activity that we observe sort of scaled for the scale of those workers. So as I mentioned, California ranks top among all states in terms of the level of research activity. 149, and this is, it's not noted on the slide, but this is data from 2020. And so when we look at 1 year, we see California generated 149 patents for every 1,000 workers in these roles. Connecticut wasn't too far behind at 116, and the average for the top 15 states here was 70. So Connecticut, you know, in terms of the research that's happening both at Connecticut businesses and at universities and other entities that are conducting this research, seems to be relatively strong and at least generating patent activity. However, when we look at the degree of product innovation, which is defined as the share of businesses that have introduced a new or significantly improved product in that year, we see Connecticut ranking 27th out of 50 states for the 4-year period from 2017 to 2020. And so
if I could interject there, I guess
Sure.
that's a question. So I'm trying to understand the implication there. Am I to read that in the purest sense, the research that leads to the registration of a patent is being done in Connecticut, but is the next step that the manufacturing of that patented technology is occurring away from us? Or is it, you know, is the skew in science and technology, is it the biomedical that's overseas manufacturing? In other words, is there manufacturing activity away from us from patent filing that we should be looking to capture?
So I don't have the answer to that question, but there are two possible explanations, and you've pointed to one of them, which is the first explanation is there's research activity that's happening in Connecticut labs that results in production elsewhere. The other potential answer is that there's research activity happening in Connecticut labs that hasn't been well commercialized at all.
Okay.
And that the first scenario would require a particular type of intervention to fix, right? That intervention might relate to improving the business climate for those companies that have chosen to locate production activity elsewhere. The second scenario essentially might relate to helping those companies actually commercialize that research and encouraging them to do that in Connecticut.
Mr. Chair, if I may add, we do know that part of the challenge for a new company trying to commercialize patents is access to capital. And in Connecticut, we have not had the advantage of venture access to capital to move some of those patents compared to New York and California. So active funding, private investment fuels a lot of that. Particularly medical devices, there is definitely a healthier access to capital in Massachusetts, for example, which is our neighbor. So a lot of those patents go there for that first starting of companies. So that's very basic to that.
Isn't advanced CT, that's their function?
I would say Connecticut Innovations is more that in the past in advanced CT, as you say, but the level of funding that some of these companies need, particularly in the bio and the medical devices, while they go through certification, is very significant. But you are right, the state has made investments, but not to the level that private capital has in California or in New York.
Maybe the product, I find that hard to believe. If it's a good product and if there's a demand for that product, then the capital will be there.
but it may not remain in Connecticut because of the cost. So
Because of-
it may not remain in Connecticut.
Because.
So a lot of those investments do come and move the product or the commercialization
What-
somewhere else. It doesn't remain in Connecticut. Because
Oh.
what we have heard from these companies is it requires an ecosystem. So we may have some investments, but there's not an ecosystem that will commercialize those products.
And what other parts are missing then?
Pardon me?
What parts are missing? If we don't have the ecosystem in place, what are the parts that are missing?
I think what we have seen so far and part of the work that we do is that you get the initial funding and now you get to create the company and find the workers, etc. And the cost of living here is significant. Now compared to California, which is as significant, there is more options for people to move around and for companies to move around. So basically you get to a point, what we call the value of debt, that the company has the initial investment and they need to raise the next funds and the next funds and the next funds. And that's when they get into trouble and they're not able to commercialize beyond that. And we do know that there's a significant level of a failure for these products, because remember, having a patent doesn't mean having a successful commercialized product.
Okay.
Thank you. Why don't we go on?
So the other way that we see the sort of the innovation dimension play out in the data is looking at supply chains that serve these three sectors. So this particular chart looks at aerospace, and then we have a similar for shipbuilding and medical devices. And there are three segments in each of these bars. The dark blue segment, and just maybe to back up a step, we've classified the inputs that each of these sectors purchases in three categories, where one category represented in the dark blue bar is high knowledge intensive inputs, meaning complex parts. You can think of these as semiconductors, precision equipment, precision components. And then we have sort of a middle category, and then what we would call the less knowledge intensive input categories, which would be basic materials, raw lumber, those types of things. And so what we see when we look at Connecticut is that, when we look at the aerospace industry and we see that 20% of inputs are being sourced from Connecticut businesses, and then we look to see what those are, right? What types of inputs are being sourced from Connecticut businesses? That's what we see in this chart. And they tend to be either somewhat knowledge intensive or less knowledge intensive inputs, meaning relatively basic inputs. You can think of those as sort of basic metal products, hardware parts, screws, bolts, nuts, as opposed to, when we look at California or Texas, we see relatively high knowledge intensive products. So those are the sort of advanced components, potentially semiconductors, and those types of parts. Now, some of that obviously, some of those industries are probably not industries that you're going to find in Connecticut and wouldn't be a focus of any kind of intervention, but there might be kind of a margin at which there are some more sophisticated types of products that could command a cost premium and would be less likely to be commoditized that could be supplied from Connecticut, but we don't see that right now as much in the data. So Connecticut, 13% of the inputs for the aerospace sector are what we would classify as high knowledge intensive relative to 20% in the US. And then, as I said, the leading states at around 40%.
Could I ask something there? I'm trying to understand the competitive advantages, disadvantages in this spreadsheet, right? So there's two pieces. I mean, you're not subjectively, but high knowledge, somewhat knowledge, low knowledge. Am I going to take those all as less and more sticky? And by that meaning, when I think about what I want to do as a state and in commerce, is I want stickier types of production skill sets that don't move away. Sometimes that knowledge is very transient.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes the physicality is less transient. So I'm trying to figure out how I rate this spreadsheet in terms of what's going to get my claws into a company that manufactures. It's going to make it difficult for them to move away once they're here.
So I would translate this into, like, just to use a simpler word than what we've used, complex or simple products.
Okay.
And if you have a complex, or you might even extrapolate that to innovative product, you potentially can command greater pricing power, right? You might not, right, a commoditized, basic, less
Mhm.
innovative product, you're accepting the market price because there's no differentiation between you and your competitors. And in a higher cost environment, producing a commoditized product is a really challenging thing to do and less likely to be sticky, right? In a decade or 2 decades, those commoditized products probably won't continue to exist in a state that doesn't have a competitive cost structure and relatively low cost labor. What could continue to exist are those differentiated, innovative, high knowledge intensive products, which are shown in the dark blue.
So you're leading me to a conclusion
It,
that I should be focusing on the higher knowledge and that we're fair to middling on the higher value
right,
aerospace product
correct.
in terms, okay.
Yeah. And so what I'm doing in this chart, it was actually, I think the last chart, was suggesting that this overall relatively positive result for in-state sourcing from the aerospace sector is perhaps not quite as good as it looks, because a lot of those products aren't products that will necessarily be here in 20 years if the cost environment isn't competitive, right? So there are products like screws and nuts and bolts, which are presumably subject to a lot of market pricing pressure right now.
Yeah, and offshoring,
And offshoring.
whether you're looking at overseas,
Right.
but I'll take a provincial view. Offshoring is anything that goes across my Connecticut border.
Right.
New Jersey
And,
is
that, and, that,
offshoring.
and that's our
as far as I'm
view in this
concerned.
study as well. Yeah.
Okay. Perfect.
So I think I've described shipbuilding, and medical devices actually has the poorest performance of the three. You can see, in some states you have advanced or, complex or knowledge intensive sourcing up in, the 40, 50% range. Connecticut is at 6% compared to the US average of 21%. All right, so then I'm going to move to the next topic, which is the talent and pipeline topic I had sort of foreshadowed earlier. So this is a little more detail on the statistic that, roughly a third of aerospace and medical device workers are 55 years or older. And you can see how that breaks down in terms of these age cohorts, as well as the total Connecticut employment base, where you have, roughly 1/4 of workers in that age range. And so the conclusion here is kind of what I've already said earlier, which is over the next 10 years, these two industries, aerospace and medical devices, will feel greater pressure than the typical Connecticut industry in the face of probably significant numbers of retiring, relatively highly skilled workers. And that becomes, for these two industries, significant. It's significant for every industry, but what we show in this chart is one reason why, which is looking at the sort of the skill requirements for the three industries in terms of training and experience, right? So you can think of this as formal training, right? So a university degree in a particular field, or work experience. And when you look at aerospace, about it's 42, 43% of workers are 52 or 53% of workers are classified as needing either considerable or extensive training and experience to be functional in that sector. And so when you think about how that happens, right, with a pipeline of, high school who become university students who then have some, post-university on-the-job training, all of that takes, perhaps 7, 8 years to happen to get someone fresh out of school who's ready to be productive in one of these two industries with all these retiring workers. And so the kind of the macro point here is there are likely to be some talent pressures over the next 10 years in these two sectors, just to sort of maintain the current level of activity. notwithstanding any growth that might be might be induced through other actions you take as a committee.
Andrew?
Yeah.
Or maybe Beatrice? Yeah. Have you presented this to the education, Department of Education? Is that, you'll be doing that? Okay, yeah. This is really good now, information, Andrew, and compliments to both of you for showing all this. It really steers us and it gives us focus to where we should be educating our youth and creating that pipeline or workforce pipeline. So, but thank you.
Terrific.
And if I could suggest as well, you've got both the Labor Department, obviously, but I think in the polemical conversation that goes on in the state of Connecticut about housing, I think this should be a conversation as well when we start thinking about supporting housing. We need to be looking at where the industry demands are, because that other piece in making companies sticky is getting entry-level workforce housing built to support the industries where we're trying to draw people to. It's providing a pipeline for jobs and growth. I'm thinking particularly our defense industry and making sure that we have adequate supply of workforce, entry-level workforce housing. And it's harder to get a company to move when we create that ecosystem. So there's a whole ecosystem that you're thinking about on the business side. I think we need to think about the other ecosystem of, if they've got 5,000 employees in housing that are here in Connecticut, it's harder to see them move on as well. So this is another anchor that we need to think about. But thanks.
Just one other comment, perhaps in addition to the State Department of Education, you may want to go right to the superintendents of all the districts and make this presentation to them as well. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to move quickly through a few of these slides. I think I've covered this material enough. Just for those of you that want to take a look after the presentation, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the next three, but what we look at here, it's just one more dimension of sort of the high complexity, low complexity sourcing discussion. So this is for aerospace. We have similar next for shipbuilding and medical device. And this is when we look at what these industries are buying and how much of what they're buying is coming from within Connecticut. We see those sort of more basic industries, forging and stamping, wire product manufacturing, machine shops. Those Connecticut manufacturers are sourcing a relatively healthy portion of their inputs in those industries from Connecticut businesses. It's when we get into, what are colored here, the green, sort of more innovative, more advanced, more complex sectors where the in-state sourcing of those inputs is significantly lower. And it's the same point I was making earlier, so I won't make it again, but this is just a little more detailed view of what goes into those different categories. And this one is for shipbuilding. And then we also have for medical device.
Could you slow walk me through that
Sure.
one more time?
Yeah. So I'm going to go back to aerospace.
Hey, that's exactly the page I was
Okay.
on, and I'm trying to chew through that.
Yeah. Okay. So when we look at the aerospace industry in Connecticut, right? So think of an aerospace manufacturer in Connecticut. They're buying lots of different types of supplies, manufactured products. They're buying raw materials. They're buying some like semi-finished parts. They're buying maybe some finished components. And this is a list of some of the items that we see a relatively large amount of purchases of. So starting with the top row, when we see a Connecticut aerospace company buying forging and stamping parts, meaning inputs of those things, 42.5% of those purchases actually are coming from Connecticut vendors. Right, so if you count up the dollars, 42.5% of the dollars they're spending on those things are coming from Connecticut vendors of forging and stamping
And with
products.
the yellow, that's a medium value product, right?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
So
And-
the highest value products are in the blue, and it's the percentage that Connecticut is contributing in-state sourcing for our in-state industry, basically.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. I think. So I guess on the thought and comment, going to the absolute worst, I guess, I look at it as a scale. Semiconductors and electronic components, I guess those probably the only value, given that semiconductors are mostly a Silicon Valley issue, or I think out in Texas. I think the question on the electronic components would be, is there an opportunity space within that area within the Connecticut industrial base? And should we help foster that? All right, thank you. Well, I will turn over to my co-chair.
Thanks so much, Mr. Chair, and thank you so much for being here. And my regrets that I wasn't able to be here with you from the start. So with regard to the slide that we're looking at now, this one relative to aerospace, did I hear you say just a bit ago that those products, screws, widgets, were kind of had a finite life span that can be easily replaced?
So yeah, I think what the comment you're referring to is those products are likely to face the most amount of market pricing pressure. And for those industries to thrive and grow in Connecticut, in the face of that market pricing pressure would require the cost environment in Connecticut to probably be more favorable. And so in the absence of an improvement in Connecticut's cost environment, the workforce housing issue that you mentioned is a really important one, bringing down labor costs by sort of bringing down the cost of living and being able to attract some workers who are willing, to accept sort of those starting wages and can find livable housing near their production facility, right? All of that would probably be required to see these more basic industries grow and thrive in Connecticut.
If I may, Chairwoman, I think one area where the state very wisely has focused their efforts is automation and process improvement. And some of the work that we've been looking at with I-4.0 through the work group that we work on speaks to that. If we are to remain competitive in products that don't require high level labor, one way to really improve on the cost piece is automation and the recognition that a lot of those innovations that come from technology will go a long way to remain our participation in those markets.
And to follow up on that, Beatrice, this is where we're talking about the 80% of the manufacturers in the state of Connecticut who are the small manufacturers. They are the Connecticut supply chain. And they are probably the ones that are in greatest need of an industry safety net, if you will, to try to bring them up to date. I use that word loosely, basically for their own survival.
Yes, basically, we have a very strong supply chain that historically has been able to generate extremely good jobs and anchor our communities, but it's at risk. In this conversation that we're having today, it's not about panic, but it is about highlighting the risk and making sure that our policy investments and our work together goes towards that. So for us as the MEP, Connecticut's MEP, it is one of our main priorities to really bring our continuous improvement tools, our automation tools, and to help our manufacturers walk through the roadmap that we spoke about 2 years ago when we presented the conclusions of the work group to really get them hand by hand to the next level of Industry 4.0.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Beatrice.
You can
Okay.
proceed, thank you.
Going to move on to the next section where we look at some of the challenges and in fact, some of those cost factors. So this slide is summarizing information that we collected in the survey. I mentioned we received responses from around 50 companies across the 3 sectors who are either OEMs or suppliers to those sectors. And the question that's shown in this chart is essentially, what are the largest challenges that you face in your operations, including those in Connecticut? And so the most frequent response was increasing operating costs, 65%. Note that as a very significant challenge. Increasing raw materials costs, which is not really a Connecticut issue, it's an industry issue. But then I think the next two are pretty interesting, which are both related to labor. So the third most frequent answer was insufficient manufacturing pipeline, meaning talent pipeline. And so this kind of gets to some of the talent issues we were talking through earlier, where 56% of the respondents indicated that as a very significant challenge. And then high cost of living that lead to an inability to hire workers were cited by 49% of the respondents. And in some of the free form questions that we asked, where we got text responses back, and also in some of the interviews, we did certainly hear a lot about workforce housing as an important issue that contributes to the perception of a high cost of living in Connecticut for the workers of these industries. And then I won't go through all of the rest of them, although, you know, one that has come up in some of the other research is looking at certifications, and so the need for small and medium-sized businesses to get certified to operate in their industry, even though that certification can be somewhat expensive and time-consuming. So just as kind of reference material here, related to cost of living here.
If I might
Oh, sorry.
interrupt, let's go back to that conversation about certifications. If you could just kind of elaborate a little bit more. We have just gotten a proposal from the governor's office with regard to streamlining of some sort of certification credentials in a very, I would say, targeted handful of professions. Difficult in meeting it because of time, money, because of standards. Just tell me more.
Yeah, so there are a variety of manufacturing certifications and industry-specific certifications that will vary across the three sectors. For medical devices, there are some FDA certifications. For the other two industries, there are ISO certifications that can be sought, as well as OEM certifications in some cases. And then the one that is sort of newer for many of the companies in the mix that relates to both aerospace and shipbuilding is the DoD cybersecurity maturity certification, where companies haven't been certified yet, but they're all, many of them are working on a way to meet some of those standards. And so those are the nature of the certifications.
They're not,
Yeah.
they're not state certifications.
They're not state certifications, no.
That's exactly where I was going to leap at you. So the question, I'm trying to figure out how we move the needle. And now we just can go complain to Senator Murphy and Blumenthal on this.
Absolutely. And if I may, one of the things that we find anecdotally from our clients is that as you go down in the supply chain, tier one gets it and they work together with the OEM. But as you go down, it becomes very difficult for the small company to figure out which ones are even relevant, which ones of the what they're being asked through their supply chain is even relevant for them. So clarification and simplicity coming from the OEMs is critical, and from DoD, and any work, as you mentioned, that either the federal delegation or we as service providers can do to elevate the cost of that complexity to small companies will go a long way. It is hard for them to figure it out, to have staff that understands what's going on, and then it keeps changing too. It's a moving target for them to really be compliant.
I think, Beatrice, you highlight something I'm finding, and it's taken me a number of years here in state government. And I'd like you to think about it from your point. There's a question of advocacy and one-stop shopping. And that at the state level, there are too many agencies involved in every product or coordinating the answer or the solicitation from a company. There are too many people who come in at different stages and can frustrate an applicant. So we might need to think about that one-stop shopping at the state level. And we probably should have that conversation to see who can be the facilitator. I would say easiest because there's only two from our senatorial staff to see if there's a troubleshooter for agency relationships in the defense industry, et cetera, or through our, whatever, 5 representatives, I believe, but through our group of representatives for the House. But we need advocacy for those companies, because what you're suggesting is they don't have the skill set, or they may be slow to that skill set, and our advocacy might be the decision about coming to work in Connecticut, because we've resolved the problem either at the federal or state level with our own agencies. So we might want to think about that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And so on a TBC here, Beatrice, I think what we need to do is structure whatever communication and whatever form of communication to summarize this issue with regard to helping out with the clarification and the complexity to those offices directly. And so I'd look to you to spearhead that so we follow up on that. Thank you.
Will do. Thank you.
Thank you. And I might add, Beatrice, just for background, we were having this conversation about building development. We've had hearings and conversations with SHPO, the State Historic Preservation Office. And we've had conversations where 3/4 of the way through a project, DEEP gets involved because something gets triggered. Department of Transportation gets triggered. They all get triggered at different points. And without an omnibus advocate, you wander from agency to agency and your problems arise, and it can be sequentially frustrating to get to a final solution. So with an advocate being your bodyguard or companion through the application process, we might want to think about that. But thank you. Sorry about that if you go back.
So I think I maybe had just started to cover this. I think the key takeaway from the slide is that housing is an important cost. And in Connecticut, housing costs, it's not that they're the highest among the peer states that are shown on this slide, which is for aerospace. But, when you look at the states that are higher, there are places like California and Massachusetts, but most of the peer set is quite a bit below, including some of the states where we've seen more rapid employment growth over the past decade. All right, and I'm now going to go to our final slide, which is kind of the so what in all of this. So what we look at in this slide, this is a bit of a hypothetical. I mentioned the share of inputs that are sourced from Connecticut suppliers across these 3 sectors, where for aerospace it's 20%, and for the other 2 subsectors it's around 9 or 10%. If Connecticut were to look more like some of the leading states that we've shown in these other charts and source a higher percentage of inputs from within the state from Connecticut suppliers, kind of in line with those other states, there would be about $337 million, $340 million of additional sales from those Connecticut businesses to Connecticut OEMs. And that would support, when you sort of look at all of the types of economic effects, the direct, indirect, and induced effects, around 1,800 jobs. And that's outside of, in addition to any jobs sort of that would occur in the OEMs themselves if there were sort of a more conducive business environment. So basically by strengthening the Connecticut supply chain, potentially sort of increasing the amount of innovation and product development that happens there, by potentially loosening some of the labor market constraints that we've talked through, which relate both to workforce housing and then potentially training, you might end up with 1,800 jobs in this scenario. And it's, this is a scenario, but it basically is, what if Connecticut were to look like some of the leading states in terms of sourcing to its own supply chain instead of bringing in goods from other places? And with that, I will conclude my presentation and happy to answer any other questions if there are any.
I want to thank you for the report. I guess I'm trying to figure out on the back of the report, the policy implementation or implication, right? Comparing myself to California, which is 45 million, 50 million, I'm not a little rusty on population. I guess the analysis of value-added product for in-state purchasing, I probably could use further assistance in terms of if there's a commonality between, I would say, the shipbuilding and aerospace on the technological components of, so I can figure out if I'm racing to get how many chip facilities built in Connecticut or other pieces of technology, value-added product where I can focus. So it'd probably help on the high-end part of the industry to look at their specific policies that would foster, encourage companies to, and that supply chain to locate in Connecticut would be helpful. Right?
Yeah.
As an initial thought. I think it's a good definition of the problem. I'm trying to figure out where we go from here. That's my first. I'm certainly willing to open it up to questions from the committee members. And I'll turn it over to my co-chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Yeah, so next steps, this is a lot to digest. I will tell you that. And of course, coming in here, on the fly, I've missed your opening, but these handouts are very well prepared. I guess I just want to ask you a question, and it might be outside of the lane here that we're talking about, but so we've got the CHIPS Act, and I am being informed that our lane here in the state of Connecticut is on the R&D side, not the actual production with the fabs and so forth. It seems like it's a once in a lifetime opportunity. And I'm just wondering if you would comment on that.
I mean, to the extent the research, it's not something we've looked at. I would
Right.
start there, but I guess to the extent that there's funding for research and not as much for production in Connecticut, I think that ends up looking somewhat consistent with what we've already seen, which is Connecticut tends to have a strong research environment. And in terms of then production related to that research, not quite as strong. I think to the comment earlier about the stickiness of activity and economic activity, production activity that is related to prior capital investments is going to be the stickiest type of activity. Research, to the extent you can generate knowledge networks and sort of human capital is great. And innovation is a type of capital, right? If it results in intellectual property, but physical capital is the hardest to move. And so to the extent there's an opportunity to attract that type of physical capital investment, whether it's through the CHIPS Act and funding available there or otherwise, that would be potentially a source of long-lived economic activity in the state.
Thank you. So to my co-chair's comments and my basic assessment here of, this is, it almost seems like we're in a position of like boiling the ocean. Give us the 3 top initiatives that will yield the best ROI and also address this issue, which looks to me like a ticking time bomb. Okay, I mean, we're looking into a crystal ball here, and it's, out, I don't know how many years you would say. Is this out 10 years? Is this out 5 years? I mean, what?
Do you want
So,
to?
yes, so I think the key here is, and what the report doesn't highlight because that was not the scope, is what the state is already doing to address these things. And when we go around the country as your MEP, we do find that Connecticut is punching above its waist on investment in these areas. Let me give you examples. So the Department of Economic Development has, through the Office of the Chief Manufacturing Officer, leads several efforts to bring knowledge, process, and models into the state. An example of these efforts are the model-based definition, scaling the model-based definition program, phase 2, where CCAT, CCSU and CONNSTEP participate actively to really look for ways to create that opportunity, that knowledge, that experience for small companies, but also for workers, for academia, to really bring those technologies into the state and prepare our supply chain, particularly in aerospace and shipbuilding, to respond to that OEM response. Another example is Connecticut Smart, which is more manufacturing applied to energy efficiency, which is also a grant that, again, the Chief Manufacturing Officer leads with UConn, CCAT, and CONNSTEP to do that work. Additionally, the work that in the emphasis that by cooperation, both from the Office of the Workforce Strategy and the Chief Manufacturing Officer have placed in not only identifying high-level workers and making sure that we're supporting those skills that you talk about, those credentialing, but also bringing in additional populations into play, reaching out to incarcerated, former incarcerated citizens, minorities, women, etc., to get into those jobs that you describe as maybe the lower end piece, and also to invest in our academic institutions to connect closer to manufacturing. So the piece that the story here is, the more we can do to the risk for companies, those investments, to make it easier. And to your earlier question, Senator Martin, money will come where ideas are, but sometimes the time frames where those ideas get to commercialize, the capital markets lose interest. And what we need to do is, in these areas, continue to make investments. An example of that investment that the state has made through its funding is Forge. So we brought Forge into the state 2 years ago. It's a non-for-profit from Massachusetts that specializes on holding those startups together to the system until they are able to commercialize. They've been very successful in Massachusetts, and the state brought their resources to bear to the Chief Manufacturing Officer in the Manufacturing Innovation Fund, and then together with CityNext. And that investment, after 2 years, is helping create that ecosystem. So in summary, it's gonna be hard work. We are positioned to continue that work. As a small state, it's even, I am very proud that we even appear on number 3 in any list. That speaks to us. So I don't want us to live with a message of doom, but what we wanted to make sure is that we provide you the data. So to your point, where are the things that we should be doing, the investment we should be doing, and the ones that we should continue to do. And in closing, from my area as your MEP, we thank you for the support over the years, but we want to continue to support our small and medium manufacturers. Our network is committed to doing that in those technology innovations, supply chains resilience, and workforce development. And we are not only capable to do it, but we in Connecticut have the gift of excellent partners. Connecticut Center for Advanced Technology, Central Connecticut State University, and the other state university, UConn, and a very, very strong partner in the Chief Manufacturing Officer and DECD.
Beatrice said, I'll make just one observation or concern that I have. In the realm of all the conversations we've had in various study groups this summer, I'd like to see further engagement with university system, community colleges specifically, on two specific areas of focus for me, which is co-location of some of our manufacturing and technology. We have, what I'm hearing is that there is a financial need from the public university system for more funding. And at the same time, I'm hearing both facilities are not fully occupied, or there's infrastructure needs at the facilities, and there are programs. And I think there might be a territorial and jurisdictional friction between granting the private sector corporations some access to the university system to echo or co-locate facilities, to give our community college students, our lower degree students, access to on-site job training while they're pursuing their degree at a place where we are working on a transportation, housing, funding basis to get our kids to those community colleges. We have a site where we're getting a population to. There might be more activity than just the traditional educational process that could go on there. And that could also provide us with a training ground for a lot of the manufacturing we're looking at. I'm not sure how closely cooperated. It's like everything else. When I suggested an agent, I find our agencies, if I see one more silo in the agency works in this state, I'm going to set my hair on fire. So I'd love to see some work there done, if possible. I know that's going to be hard because
Yeah,
you'll be working on breaking down agency barriers, but I'd like to see what we could do there, please.
and if I may, those wraparound services that you kind of highlighted are key to engaging different type of populations into our manufacturing space. Traditionally in Connecticut, our manufacturing is suburban and remote. And a lot of these populations that we highlighted earlier are urban. So I totally.
And we're already
agree.
doing it to get them to university.
Yep.
Let's see if we can't get our corporations and our entrepreneurs at those same locations to build out that recognition. I think we could do more there. And it might not be under the auspice, it may be a that I was specific on the echo or co-location of those activities, because it might not be directly under the control. And that's part, I think, where you might end up with an interesting jurisdictional conversation. So
One
but I would
thing
suggest
that I may mention, if I may, and there is a model in the United States, in Wichita State. Wichita State is a system, and we have here President Toro behind me, and she's very familiar with that model. And she actually introduced me to it, where the state actually went and incorporated the system, both from the high school level to the community college to the university level, into one pipeline for manufacturing. And the way it is funded, obviously the state funded it together with federal grant, but they also have brought industry into bringing those specific skills needed for industry. So a student in that system basically moves from high school to college, to community college or to college, while working directly with industry. And my understanding is that basically anyone that comes from that system has a job. Professors are basically incentivized to bring products and technologies and curriculum that serve industry. So it's industry-led, industry-funded. And I don't have, obviously, the details. I'm not a specialist in education, but I know that that's something that idealistic President Toro, I, and others have talked about at least modeling for our state.
I think Senator Martin is chomping at the bit.
Yeah, I think that's a great opportunity for us to learn from. If you think about the Industry 4.0 that is in front of us, and what we've heard anyway here as a committee, how imperative it is for us to I guess, be adaptive and be nimble to regarding that industry specifically. What better way than to have the partnerships with the business community right there with the education educators, right, on campus. And here's business bringing in, hey, we've got to do this now in conjunction with the educating of that workforce, how much quicker can we get than being right there together? So to the point of Senator Mesker's regarding the jurisdictions and those barriers that exist there, that's something that we really have to really break down those barriers and get everybody at the table and say, hey, let's make this thing happen. Thank you.
Thank you for the promotion to the Senate. Representative Cheeseman.
And I might quibble on the promotion idea, but I just want to follow on from that, from both Representative Mesker's and Senator Martin's comments. You answered one of my questions, is what can we learn from other states? Are there models that are working successfully, like the one you mentioned in terms of Wichita State? We don't need to reinvent the wheel. I'm a great believer, if we can steal great ideas from other people who've already done the hard work, the more the better. And I would be very interested to see more active work in terms of Connecticut doing this. I know many of the southern states, when they were first attracting the automobile manufacturers, they brought them into the room and said, what courses of study would you like us to design to equip the workers you will need to do these jobs? And I think there's no better way in terms of producing the skills needed. But again, it's in the interest of these industries to have the skilled workers. I firmly believe they should have skin in the game. We know the state does not have the funds that are unlimited. And if we can create those incentives, because the end result is the one we all want, a more successful Connecticut, more successful industry, more jobs, which at the end of the day is what we need to have the revenue to do all the programs we need, that we know our residents need. So Wichita State is great, but are there other models we could emulate? Thank you. Thank you very much, Chairman.
Thank you very much, Representative. And I was going to go back, and I guess Representative Cheeseman got in front of me on that. I was going to say, it was helpful to a certain extent, your little circles that I was looking at with the states. I think it would probably be helpful on a comparative basis to understand within those circles if there are material policy differences, as per Representative Cheeseman. So if it's, we were mentioning the university, but let's Kansas. I'm not sure why they're up there. And Alabama, if it's just labor, I don't think I can go for a $7 minimum wage, so I'm not going to compete with Alabama. But I want to know if there's policy issues that are driving some of the growth in some of the states that are moving up the scale, and to figure out where those policy issues that we should be looking at adopting. It's the same type of plagiarism we're suggesting, that if the states figured out a policy that everyone loves, we need to look at it.
One advantage of the MEP system is that it allows us to try to tap into that knowledge of the network. We are Connecticut's MEP, well, we're part of a network of 50 plus Puerto Rico. So and some of these MEPs, for reference, reside at the DCD. Some of them are, like us, 501c3, but others are also at universities. So we are very committed of using the power per se of the network to try to learn more. 2 weeks from now, the first week of March, we will be in DC advocating for the network, and that will be a very good opportunity for me and for my team to really begin peeling the onion per se on this report. To us, this report is our first step towards really identifying those best practices and sharing it with you, because obviously the value of data is in application, correct? And in making a better place for our state, a better place for their citizens.
I'm going to ask if there's any other questions from committee members. If not, I'm going to turn it over to my co-chair. And I'll let her, the request is going to be that you forward your presentation to our federal delegation, so the representatives and senators, I believe. But
Well, First of all, I just wanted to ask Beatrice, so we talked last year, I think it was, about CONNEXT, which was the data supply chain system that we were participating in
Correct.
for our Connecticut manufacturers. And so I'm wondering what that experience is. We're a year into it, I'm
Yep.
remembering. And so there's what our manufacturers are benefiting from, but also are we then benefiting from being on that database to export our products for supply chain to other US
Yeah.
or otherwise
So,
manufacturers?
we, as you correctly mentioned, we have been in this project for 1 year now, and we're starting the second year. And for reference, this particular investment was an investment that the Chief Manufacturing Officer made in providing free access to all manufacturers in Connecticut to this database. The first year has been very successful. We got so far more than 500 manufacturers on it. But it's also a learning experience for us. So what we learned was that just being in the database is not gonna get you much. You need to really work at it. So we pivoted during the year, and we actually have Bernice Tampano, which is someone that knows a lot about those systems you were talking about. She retired from the Department of Labor. She was there for 30+ years. And she's been working with manufacturers at improving their profiles. So what does that mean? You're showing yourself on a network, you have to put your best case forward. So you have to have a profile that becomes attractive to other suppliers and to the OEMs. So we've been working on those certifications, trying to show those certifications. I'm ready to work, basically. I'm ready to mingle. With that, there has been some successes, a lot of interactions, and she may help me with the numbers, a lot of connections, and then some companies have found actual contracts through it. And we have one case of a manufacturer that was bringing their products from another state and found a supplier like 3 miles or something like that from their house here, from their office. So it is successful. We will continue to work at it. The reality of it is companies will get as much as they put in. And it goes back to those risks, correct? I don't have people in my little company to be able to do that. Where we see our role, and we are talking a lot about that on how to do phase 2 of this project and continue, is to what extent we, CONNSTEP, can provide that over, service. And the challenge with that is the data is today a third party. We own the data for the state, but in reality, it is fueled, let's say, by another company. So several MEPs are on it. 18 MEPs today are on it, plus El Paso, Texas, Economic Development. So we're looking at a national level for ways to really standardize the process and make sure that it's not only I am in Connecticut and buying Connecticut, but I'm in Connecticut and I can get a supplier in business next in other states of the country. It does not today, while that network is open for export, we are not available. That's not available today. Very focused in Connecticut.
Matrix, as we're having the conversation, so I've got 3 children, well, children, 20, 30, 28, 26. And what I'm seeing in some of the high-tech industries, et cetera, is there is a fragmentation in the industry and a spin-off, whether it be human resources, whether it be legal consulting, et cetera. And I'm wondering, when we look at this industry and what we're talking about, there needs to interact either as suppliers with the defense industry, as arrangements with the Department of Defense and the connectivity, whether that becomes part of the state's role, or whether the state needs to foster among our industry contacts an intermediate company whose sole role is the engagement process with, whether it's the state, the federal, or the network because we may want to think, is there a way to make this easier? Because if you've got an innovation guy, you've got somebody who's working in the front office, creating the ideas, he may need someplace to go that's going to alleviate him of those burdens. In the short term, we can do something as a state, but we almost have to think, is there an intermediate company in that office of manufacturing? Is there not just a helpline, but a group that begins to work on the process, whether it be facilitating patent applications, facilitating supply and demand, or the entire process to where it's going to get the people that we want in the state. We're going to take one of their burdens away from them, because they may not, when you talk about putting skin in the game, they may not have either the intellectual resources if they're smaller
Yep.
to get through the process. And so we may need to think about who does that. I'm not saying it has to be us as a state, but if we have to foster a group, we work through the university system. Can we create a work study group to figure out how to get that, provide that backbone of support to new companies?
Thank you.
Just a thought.
Thank you, Beatrice, but I just want to go back to our conversation about Connex. So long story short, we're into it a year. It was funded through the
Manufacturing
yeah.
Innovation Fund.
yes, with the chief manufacturing officer. Is it worth our while? Because the question then becomes, are we going to continue it because this was a free service, or do you offer it on a fee for service?
I think my assessment today has been quite successful. And let me tell you why. The investment that the state made, while obviously significant, has allowed us to identify a lot of companies that were not even participating in any services. So Connecticut, as small as it is, 3 million people, and you're able to go in 2 hours from one side to the other one, it is quite fragmented. We know that. A lot of companies don't know what's available to them. So the big investment that the state made in promoting to this platform has allowed us to get there. And I always tell my team, it's like a Trojan horse. And this Trojan horse, I want to be in a network so I can find customers, has generated with us the ability as the MEP service provider to go and say, yeah, now you're in the platform, so what's next? Oh, we need to create your profile. And what's next? You don't have this certification. Maybe you need to think about this. So that effort of doing that, to me, has allowed us to identify many that needed help that didn't know they were able to get that. So to us, it's been a really good way to really reach a different constituents, to invest in it. And there have been significant wins. It is growing. Other states are getting on it, and then the federal government is getting on it. So that, I would say, it is too soon to say we should do something else. Now, to your question, will people remain if it is not paid, subsidized? I really cannot answer that question at this point.
Thank you, just for that. Okay, so what I was about to say a couple of minutes ago is that, just one of the things that we're going to walk away with today is the fact that we want to, as a priority item, communicate with the federal delegation, although, we have shared this initially with them. But under the cover of the Commerce Committee, to share with them copies of these booklets that you send out, but also the letter that we talked about, some minutes ago.
Yes.
That I'd like to work with you on, and then we can put a whole package together in a very cogent, kind of targeted way, with obviously the issue of the clarification and the complication issue on the certifications as kind of being highlighted.
Absolutely.
Okay, so if you
Thank
can
you.
provide us with those resources, and then also we'll talk about the copy which we will share with the Commerce Committee, so it can go under our letterhead. Yeah, thank you very much.
So I believe we have a question from Representative Cheeseman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And I apologize if this is included in your report, but one of the things that occurred to me when it comes to businesses doing business and locating here is our high energy costs, particularly the cost of electricity. In your breakdown of looking at other states, is that segmented out? I know it's always a concern, not only for our residents, but it's also, it may be a hindrance. You can sometimes justify locating here because of our high skill level of our workers, but it's hard to get away from the high cost of power because that's a given. So I'm just curious as to if that appears and how that may factor into growth of an industry.
It's an excellent question. I actually would need to check to see if it's shown separately in the report. I would say in the sort of hierarchy of business cost, and it varies by sector, right? If you're doing a lot of really intense sort of metal, heated metal work, then you're going to have higher energy cost. But labor is always, by far leaps and bounds. I would need to check and get back to you to see if and how we incorporated like electricity costs specifically into the model.
Thank you. I'd be very interested to see that because I know
We have the
there are
data.
people here on the Energy Committee and know that are certainly one of the concerns in this state. As I say, you can sometimes justify, well, it's a very high skill level. It's hard to spin high electricity and high energy costs as a plus for a business. So I appreciate that. Thank
Okay.
you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
So I think thank you very much for the presentation. You've answered a couple of good questions, gave us a good perspective, given us food for thought on policy and solutions. And I hope we've left you with some ideas of where we'd like to see, focus going forward. I'm going to call the information forum to a close, take a 5-minute break, and we'll be going on to our second forum. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the time.
Thank you.